Hello and welcome to another special episode of the Minor Issues Podcast. I'm Mark Thornton at the Mises Institute. This week, I'm playing an interview I did with Darrell Thomas, who is the host of Money Level Show, an episode that is hosted by VRIC Media, the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, which is one of the largest conferences of that sort in the world, really. And in this episode, Darrell and I talk about a whole host of current issues, starting really with ideological issues that have greatly impacted our government and its policies, but then dealing with and addressing, in many cases in a supply and demand analysis, things like the tariffs and the deficits. We go through a whole laundry list, really, of important issues, and then how all of that sort of is showing up in the world economy in terms of the K-shaped economy, which is my bread and butter as far as the Austrian business cycle theory is concerned, but as well as inflation, growth in the economy, what's happening in gold and silver, precious metals markets. And so it was a very wide-ranging interview. It was very enjoyable to do, and I want to thank Darrell for interviewing me on all of these topics. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Minor Issues Podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Mark Thornton of the Mises Institute. How you doing today, Mark?
Darrell, I'm doing great. It's great to be on your show.
Yes, first time on the show. Would love to have you just do a brief introduction of who you are and such. I know we've interviewed some of your colleagues before, and so let's hear from Mark. Let's give the audience a brief synopsis of who you are.
Well, I'm affiliated with the Mises Institute, and I've been affiliated with them for many, many years here in Auburn, Alabama. And I actually got my PhD in economics from Auburn University, which is across the street. I did my dissertation on the economics of prohibition and dangerous drugs. And I've been working and, researching on economics and monetary economics in the business cycle. My latest book is on the skyscraper curse, which is an indicator of economic crisis in the economy that has a spooky sort of correlation that goes back more than 100 years. And so we do a lot of teaching of high school and college students. We have professional conferences that I'm a part of and help manage and organize. We have conferences for, the general public and professional groups. We publish books and newsletters. It's all free on mises.org. And we even have some academic journals. And so we're a one-stop shop, really the worldwide center of Austrian free market economics.
Yeah. We were talking offline, and I said that it feels like I'm getting into the ring with champions at this point, because I consider myself an Austrian, aligned with Austrian economics as well as libertarianism and such. And so it's always good to meet someone who's been doing that work for a while. And you have multiple books and publications that you've put out over the years. And so definitely encourage the audience to do some research and check out what you've been putting out over the years. I do want to start with the United States economy. And so I think it'll be good to go like two directions with this. The first direction, I think about the Keynesian economics and the position that we're in now. Like, how has Keynesian economics got us to the position where we have our debt skyrocketing, our deficits are skyrocketing. A lot of what we see is historical and such in some ways, based on some of the work that I've been reading of Ray Dalio and such. And so just curious in your perspective, from an Austrian economist perspective, on Like, what kind of damage is this Keynesian economics doing to the U.S.? And then also just want to get your perspective on the true state of the U.S. economy as well.
Well, that's a great question. And I think we're being misled about the true state of the U.S. economy. And a lot of that does have to do with Keynesian economics and the falsification that government is interjecting into our economy. All of that spending, all of that borrowing, and the Keynesians think that government spending and government borrowing is actually something that stimulates the economy, that causes it to go up. And Austrians see it as really just an accounting entry to a certain extent, that government is taking in money and it's just spending it, borrowing it and spending it, and that's running up the numbers like GDP. And of course, the forecasts right now are for increases in gross national product. But that's just an accounting entry. That doesn't make the economy stronger. It doesn't make it more productive. It doesn't make households more resilient. It doesn't increase the standard of living, because that comes from an entirely different process. It comes from, market signals. It comes from entrepreneurs and, shareholders and so forth, accumulating capital over time, building up bigger, stronger businesses over time. And that's simply not happening. If we take a real look at the U.S. economy, we see it as really weaker over time. And you can see that in individual balance sheets where people are not able to save in an economy where prices are rising and real incomes and wages are stagnant in a relative sense. People are having a difficult budgeting situation. People are borrowing. People are using their credit cards. They're using all these new apps where they can buy now and pay later. We're seeing, people not being able to keep up with their credit card balances, where businesses are having a tough time financing, their inventories and their accounts receivable, and they're cutting back on inventories to stay afloat. They're cutting back on employees to stay afloat. And so there's this general weakness because we haven't been adding to our savings and adding to the capital stock, getting bigger and better tools for workers to use. We've been borrowing money. The government's just been spending, mostly wasting our money. And as a result, we're not really adding to that structure. And so, there's been a lot of talk the last couple of years about the K-shaped economy, where most of the economy is going downhill, where a lot of the lower class, the middle class, their economic circumstances are going downhill in a relative sense. And there's a small group, the upper 10%, let's say, is often referred to. They're doing extremely well based on the stock market and profits and things of that nature. And their spending has been increasing on travel and luxury goods and, all of that kind of stuff. And that's really, that depiction of the economy, this disjointed K-shaped economy, is really the fundamental economy, when we break it down. And so really 2/3 to 3/4 of American households are struggling. They're in serious difficulties, or they're in, circumstances of foreclosure, bankruptcy, falling behind on their credit card bills, not being able to even break even on their paychecks. And then a very small group that's either breaking even or doing well because the stock market has been doing well, or they're part of some lucrative government contract or something like that. But that's a small percentage. And so what we see about those general trends of borrowing by the government and a lack of savings in the economy or even in the corporate structure, we're starting to see corporations, small and middle, being tapped out. And now even those mega corporations in Silicon Valley that are leading the artificial intelligence revolution, they're finding that they're at the end of their credit rating, right? Because they've been borrowing so much money to finance the artificial intelligence revolution. So I think we're up against, we've got our backs against the wall right now.
Okay, so you mentioned a few things, quite a few things I want to hone in on. So one is the small businesses. So many people migrate to the U.S. because they want to get out of either authoritarian regimes, and they want to live the American dream or whatnot. And you got people that want to start a business. You have entrepreneurs out there, and I know that during the pandemic, the response there was very harmful to small businesses. So I'm curious on where do those businesses stand now?
Well, I think they're struggling as well. Now, some of them are very much, they don't rely very much on credit. A one-person firm, a little retail establishment, but the big price swing dynamics that were caused during COVID and the aftermath, in terms of the labor market, the ability to borrow, even from their suppliers, they've been subject to a lot of whipsaws in the marketplace. Some of them, we had really low oil prices, for example, during COVID. So it's not all necessarily completely in the negative, but most of it's been in the negative. And small businesses, do very well in a free market economy and in a free market economy, prices of just about everything are relatively stable. Wage rates, interest rates, input costs, raw materials, that all tends to be relatively stable, so that entrepreneurs can make calculations which they can rely on, and they see opportunities to make money to serve customers either at the retail level or at the wholesale level, and they can jump in with some certainty. And in the absence of that certainty and in the presence of all these government interventions which see prices, interest rates, and wages, and the availability of labor, and so on, whipsawing around, it makes it much more difficult for small and medium-sized businesses. And in a relative sense, it makes it easier for big corporations to adapt to those kind of changes. So, I always think first and foremost about small and mid-sized companies, where politicians typically don't. They're usually getting checks from big corporations and big interest groups to finance their next campaign. I'm not getting any checks from those people. And I realize, like most economists and entrepreneurs, realize that most of the jobs, a lot of the new products, a lot of the new franchise businesses, they all start from the bottom up. They start with small and medium-sized businesses. So everybody realizes from an historical point of view that that's where economic growth and prosperity come from. And that's what raises our standard of living over the long run. And it's something that politicians are kind of insulated from, because they don't get campaign contributions from small and middle-sized businesses, so they go undetected. They're not on the radar screen, and that's really a huge disconnect in our political system.
Yeah. Okay. And how does tariffs play into this, especially for smaller businesses? I know Professor Steve Hanke, he's at the Mises Institute as well.
Yes.
And he has been posting some things about some studies coming out about the tariffs and their actual impact on the average citizen And I imagine there's some impacts on smaller businesses as well. And so curious in your perspective there.
Well, yeah, that's a perfect example because large scale businesses have ways that they can directly manipulate to avoid the tariffs. They can completely reroute distribution chains around the globe. And so Nike, can make those kind of adjustments. They can uproot and move factories from one country to another, and they can, redevelop supply chains. Whereas small businesses, all of a sudden, one of their inputs prices goes way, way up, and it basically completely prices their final output product out of the marketplace, and they don't have any way really of adapting to that. Now, typically, small businesses does much better job of adjusting to changing market conditions. But when those market conditions are rigged politically, and you see these giant swings over which the small business doesn't have any control, they don't have any resort that they can make to adapting to those big changes. So if the price of lumber goes up 50%, or the price of aluminum goes up 50%, and your product is based on aluminum, it's going to be very, very difficult. And so your only choices really come down to slashing all your cost, or going out of business, or drastically raising your price. And so free trade is great for small and medium-sized businesses. It's great especially for new businesses to come in the marketplace. But tariffs are terrible for small and medium-sized businesses. And the discrete tariffs that we've seen here recently have a relative advantage for the mega corporations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. So I think the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on that this upcoming week. I think I read something about potentially on Friday. And so what are the possible outcomes here? Like, if they say that the tariffs are illegal according to the Constitution or whatnot, and only Congress can impose a tax, what happens in that situation? What do you think are the possibilities there? And then what happens if they, rule that he could proceed with that under the emergency? I think it's under emergency powers. And so just curious, and what are the possible outcomes there?
Well, of course, they can rule for or against the president, for or against these tariffs. I think they should rule against them. But of course, then there's always the president coming back and reimposing the tariffs on the basis of some other authority, which they claim to have, or Congress could go in and impose them on the behalf of the president. And, the big thing here is that it's not just the magnitude and the negative magnitude of the effect of the tariffs, but also the uncertainty and the whiplashing of American businesses and the American entrepreneur as a result of these things. So, I'd like to be able to wave a magic wand and see all of this go away and return to a completely free trade system that we've moved so far away from. But, and it would be good if the Supreme Court ruled against the tariffs. It would be good, especially for the long-run development of the American economy. There's no question about it, but there would still be a tremendous amount of political uncertainty that would negatively affect the American entrepreneur, the American worker, and the American household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know that many businesses have trouble with long-term planning, especially when the tariffs were implemented. Many businesses put on like hiring freezes because of the uncertainty of like, okay, how is this cost going to impact their businesses and such, and so they just stop hiring. And so I was definitely thinking about that, like, yeah, it is hard to plan, especially if, 1 minute is tariffs on, next minute is tariffs off. This country gets tariffs, this country doesn't get tariffs, and then it can switch on a dime, right? It's hard for businesses to even plan around that.
Oh yeah, it's very hard, and you can go in and ask individual businesses, especially if they have to deal with overseas markets to sell their products into or to buy inputs from. The benefits of free trade in America, or relative free trade in America, is that we've been able to develop this global economy where we've been able to rely on the relative performance of overseas markets to keep down the American cost of living. And that's been able to help us offset the cost of monetary inflation by the Federal Reserve. If not for our access to foreign markets, both as inputs and as buyers of our products, Americans would be much, much poorer as a result, and we would have felt much more of the negative consequences of all this money printing by the Fed over the decades. And so it's insulated the American public and the American economy from a lot of those negative effects. I mean, in the opening up of, everybody's down on China, but, if China hadn't opened up and become, a producer, opened up its markets and sold us goods at much lower prices, sure, there's negative cost to all that, but in terms of lowering the cost of living in the United States, it's been an enormous boon to the American economy and the American consumer.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So you mentioned the Fed and the money printing. So obviously we have fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal side of things, national debt's approaching 40 trillion. We have the deficit is significant, and then we have a lot of, a huge amount of like off balance sheet liabilities as well. And we've seen the Fed balance sheet grow significantly, especially after the great financial crisis and COVID. They started shrinking it a little bit, and then they've already pivoted back to balance sheet expansion. And so I'm curious, there's been a lot of talk about the Fed independence. Jerome Powell had gotten charged with the crime or investigated or whatnot. And and then the issue of independence, as well as Fed Governor Lisa Cook, that situation. So this whole thing with Fed independence has been coming up, and that's been like a major topic. And I know that whenever we get to a certain point in this cycle historically, the federal government is pretty much in bed with the Fed, and the Fed backstops the government spending. And so just curious into your perspective there.
Well, this relates back to the first question and, the enormous increase in the size of the American government and the fact that we've been borrowing money to finance the government. So we've been running very, very large, almost wartime-like annual deficits for many, many years now in order to finance current spending by the government. And we've gone from a national debt of a few $1 trillion up to $39 trillion. And now, of course, we're seeing the interest expense on the national debt really start to balloon, almost going straight up. If you look at the graph over time, it was, a normal linear type progression, and now it's like going straight up. And that's, projected to continue, so that interest on the national debt is going to be larger than all of the money we spend on national defense, which is considerable in its own right. And so this is a major problem. We don't really see the Fed is really truly independent of the political process in any respect. They put on, the idea that there's a Fed independence and the Fed is supposed to address unemployment and the Fed is supposed to keep down price inflation over time, their dual mandate. I see their dual mandate really is serving Wall Street in the sense of trying to bail them out during a stock market crisis, and also then bailing out the government during a debt crisis. And both of those functions, serving Wall Street and serving the federal government spending addiction, is done by purchasing government bonds. And that injects new money into the economy, which is inflation. And so we can expect a lot more of that. And that's really the poison in the American economy. It's what, causes prices to go up, which we all know and experience, but it also allows the federal government to grow in size without directly impacting the amount of taxes that we have to pay. It also destabilizes stock markets. It causes booms and busts. It's also what causes the K-shaped economy, right? Because if you're in the top 20% and you own stocks and you own land and you own real estate, well, those lower interest rates that the Fed can maneuver, those are all very helpful to the wealthy. But they don't really do anything positive for the working class, the low-income classes, the people without large stock portfolios, the people who don't own a home, and don't have protection against the price inflation. So it also creates this K-shaped economy. And so it advantages everybody in the power elite class of, the super wealthy and Wall Street and Washington, D.C., but everybody else, it has a negative effect. And, so it's very highly problematic. And it just speaks of our current addiction to paper money inflation, essentially, although it's done electronically in modern times. But like any other addiction, it weakens the person who's in that addiction, and it basically degrades and downgrades and hurts, undermines the health of that person or that economy, and eventually will bring it to their knees.
Mm. Okay, so right now the talk is lower interest rates. Obviously, we can look at an M2 money supply chart, and we see that the money supply has went up significantly over time. And so, with lower interest rates, do you see that accelerating, that M2 money supply chart? Do you see that accelerating significantly?
Yes, I do see it as significant, and I think that's what's bolstering the idea that the economy is going to grow. The idea that the Fed is increasing the money supply, and with the hope that money is not all just going to go finance the government deficit, but some of it would go into the private economy and finance investment and expansion of companies actually in the economy, and maybe hire workers and things of that nature. So, there is a kind of a plus side in the short run that money might make it through the banking system and not just to finance the government debt. Now, of course, these charges against Powell and the Fed and board members, is a push on the part of President Trump and the political class to get lower interest rates. They realize they can see the same charts that I see, that you see, about the government debt and about interest rates and how much we have to pay in interest on that national debt. And so they're very worried about that. And so they want to see lower interest rates. In fact, President Trump mentioned this just a couple of days ago, that if they cut interest rates by 2%, that hypothetically the federal government could save hundreds of billions of dollars in interest payments. And there's talk about the new incoming Federal Reserve Chairman Kevin Warsh as willing to suppress low term interest rates, and that he might be interested in engaging on yield curve suppression, which means forcing down low short-term interest rates as well as longer-term interest rates, and just to keep the Fed weighing in on all lengths of government debt and, suppressing the entire yield curve. Now, you can do that. That makes the federal budget deficit situation look better. That might bring down mortgage rates, but it also is very likely going to undermine the U.S. dollar, drive the value of the U.S. dollar lower. This is also something that President Trump advocates, a lower value of the dollar to spur exports in the economy. So he's clearly what economists call a mercantilist. And that would take another show to explain all that. But it would suppress the value of the U.S. dollar. And that's something that the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury, they always traditionally speak of a strong U.S. dollar. So this is an aberration on the part of President Trump to openly advocate a lower dollar. And a lower dollar means that the price of imports, of everything the U.S. imports, would go up. And it would also be a tremendous stimulus to imported raw materials, including gold and silver prices.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I do want to get to gold and silver. So dollar goes lower. Ultimately impacts the purchasing power, especially. Right now I've seen multiple charts where foreign currencies are breaking out against the dollar and such, because the dollar has come down a little bit from where it was over the past 5 years. So when was the last time we saw this? Was this like in the was it 2008 when the dollar went this low, or the 70s, or when's the last time we saw this on a historical basis, and what kind of implications were because of the lower dollar?
Well, longer term, the dollar index, which measures the value of the dollar versus other currencies, doesn't have a systematic effect on the price of gold and silver because all of the other currencies are also inflating. But in the short run, it's very important. It's a real direct, visible signal to markets. And I will point out that the dollar index was about to break to new recent lows in that index the day that President Trump nominated Kevin Warsh to be the Fed chairman. And when then right after that, of course, gold and silver prices crashed. So right before then, that dollar index was about ready to set a low that goes back a year or more. Now, longer term, because all these paper currencies are going up and down against one another, longer term, there's more fundamental factors that drive the price of gold and silver. But in the short run, the best indicator in the short run is that dollar index. because it indicates, hey, the world's largest economy, their currency is going down. And so anytime that happens, you see, the price of gold and silver go up, the price of oil and other international commodities goes up because all of these products are traded in world markets in terms of dollars. So it's kind of like the leading edge of the change in these ultra important commodities. Longer run, though, we're going to be looking at other factors going back to things like government spending, government borrowing, interest payments, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot of newer investors in the precious metals and buying precious metals to store their wealth, and as well as like gold miners and such. We recently had our Vancouver Resource Investment Conference where I met a lot of new investors to the sector. So I'm curious with the gold measured in dollars going up because the dollar's going down, right? I'm curious, like, when do we see like more of the average people getting involved? I mean, because is it more of like they see their purchasing power is not gaining as much, and headlines of gold and silver going higher, that they begin to pile into metals? Like, when does the average people typically wake up to these dynamics?
Well, I think it's a marginal process where people gradually are exposed to this. And I would say that when silver went above $50 and then when gold went over $5,000, those are news events that actually get reported in the media, and gold and silver are not reported in the mainstream media at all. I mean, this whole massive move in silver was never reported in most mainstream outlets until the price actually crashed, because they only want to sell the negative story. And so, I knew very few regular people, friends and family members type people that were even aware really of what was going on in this marketplace. I think more people are aware of it. And it's regrettable that a lot of people who've gotten interested lately might have gotten burned by this crash, this recent flash crash in the market that was kind of engineered out of Washington and Wall Street. But, it's going to come, and more people are going to wake up to it. The price inflation level, as it's being reported to the general public, has stabilized. And so they're not happy with things, but they're really unaware of how much negative effect the Fed is having on their standard of living. I think if oil was to go up simultaneous with gold and silver, and they see that price at the pump, that might be a big event in terms of driving more and more people into inflation hedges in the economy. So I would look for that. I would look for a stabilizing and a resumption of the uptrend in gold and silver, because a lot of people are freaked out right now that gold didn't just continue to go, to the moon, right to $10,000. And then the oil price and gasoline prices, that really has a wake-up effect on the general public.
Yeah. I'm curious if, in your thoughts, do you think gold has been undervalued, and we're going through like an initial repricing of the metal currently? Because I'm kind of wondering, we have this dynamic of the K-shaped economy. There's been many studies where there's a lot of Americans that can't afford a $500 emergency expense. And so I've been thinking about gold going higher in terms of like, okay, how can these folks buy some gold? And I have been seeing things like the gold back, or it seems like the fractional gold has been coming a lot becoming more popular, like the 1/1000th of an ounce, the 1/100th of an ounce and such. And I've been buying gold since 2020. And so I've been thinking like, okay, is that the way that people will get more involved? I mean, even thinking about silver, I mean, silver was what, $30, you know, you can get it for $30 an ounce, you know, a year ago and such. And now you're paying about 80 to $90 or whatnot. And so, curious with gold value, the value of gold in terms of like in dollars. Do you think this is a repricing, or was gold just undervalued for a long time? And then do you think that this fractional way of ownership is a way for people to like get involved that may not have, you know, the capital to buy like a full ounce or whatnot?
Well, I certainly think silver was, you know, very undervalued, and gold was undervalued for a long, long time. And that we are in the process of kind of resetting the marketplace in these metals. This happens periodically in a lot of different commodities, but gold and silver are the monetary commodities, and they still are a reflection, as they've always been, about the economy. And, you know, when we're on a gold and silver standard in the economy, both gold and silver have a remarkably constant purchasing power that stays uniform for very, very long periods of time. And so when we see the price of gold and the price of silver today change so radically, that's not a reflection of anything about about gold itself. It's more of a reflection of governments and government policies and the financial difficulties that the world is in right now. And so I think you should treat this repricing, you know, say you just can't afford to buy an ounce of gold, which is, you know, most people, you know, you should still benefit from this rising price by being alerted to the fact that, you know, we're in some economic troubles, that the global economy, that the global human society is in trouble right now. There are significant problems that exist right now. So you can benefit without even buying it, just by knowing that, hey, we need to all wake up and do something about this situation, because the alarm bells are ringing. Gold is like the canary in the coal mine. You know, if it keels over, it tells us there's danger ahead. And so that's something that everybody is given for free. Now, as to, you know, and I'm a big advocate of silver stacking, have been all my life, you know, as a way of saving, you know, every pay period or periodically taking some of your government currency units and exchanging them for whatever amount of metal that you can get for it, and then just stacking that over time as a form of savings. It's a maintaining of your wealth, and it's an emergency fund, you know, all of those things. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so making minimum purchases, not having a local coin shop, you know, there's a lot of difficulties in the average individual doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So the central bank's buying of gold. So there's I was reading a recent piece from Ray Dalio where I guess it was at the Munich Security Conference or something like that, where the German, I forgot. I don't know if it's chancellor or what professor. It's one of these titles. Got up and said that pretty much the 1945 agreement amongst these nations is pretty much dead. Like the Bretton Woods is pretty much dead. And so, and currently the act of central banks buying gold is a signal of distrust, as well as, you know, understanding like, okay, the U.S. is running massive deficits. You know, we can sanction anyone that we want. and things of that nature, right? And so I'm curious, what does that look like on a historical basis? Are countries going to go to a gold-backed standard, or like what are they, obviously preparing for, and what does this look like in the future?
Well, that that just highlights, the alarm status of gold, that we are in a world of global political conflict. The gold standard was, all about international cooperation on a market basis. And now we're in a situation where, the trouble is evident and widespread, and even central banks don't trust other central banks. And so they're, hoarding gold and not buying paper, U.S. treasuries and other currencies as their reserve assets. This underlines the international conflict that exists in the world amongst the superpowers and the political blocs: China, Russia, India, Europe, the Middle East, the United States, and so on. And so, where this all goes is very, very uncertain, and that is what really catapults the price of gold and silver ever higher. Now, ideally, we would go back to a gold standard. We would go back to the ideas of small government and free trade that Ludwig von Mises advocated his whole life. And he saw, domestic government intervention in the economy as ultimately leading to conflict internationally, because those domestic policies impact foreign markets, and the impact on foreign markets and protectionism leads to conflicts between, the politicians of different governments. And ultimately, this can lead to war. And we're kind of right now already in a Cold War type situation. And so, as far as the individual is concerned, yes, I think it's important to have inflation hedges. But more importantly, we're all going to have to stand up to this situation. And, we can't remain silent to this problem, because politicians, they're happy kicking the can down the road. They make money from that. They have power because of that. The political elites make money off of this kicking the can down the road, of this paper money type system. They're the ones that benefit. So we have to stand up to these political elites and take back essentially the system from them, and decontrol it, and bring us back to a market-based economy, a limited government-based society, and where we can start to restore competition and cooperation internationally, because I'm not in conflict with anybody in China or India or Europe. I mean, I buy stuff that, gets processed in India and China and, Mexico and Canada. I'm not in conflict. It's my politicians who are creating these divides and causing these troubles internationally. And we have to stand up before they completely break the entire system, because if left to their own devices, that's exactly what they will do. They will continue to kick the can down the road until the whole system breaks.
Yeah, I totally agree. So thinking about that, okay, so one is people have to stand up with their voices. I mean, outside of, getting your own personal nest egg of gold and silver to protect your wealth and such, ensure your wealth, people have to stand up. So I was kind of curious on that note, because I think that we are in such a financialized economy in the West. Like when you think of like the East and China and India, like buying gold has been part of their culture and such for a long time. Gold and silver has been real money to them for thousands of years. And then here, we're used to, right, I think recently we had Pam Bondi touting the Dow at 50K. But when you look at the Dow to gold ratio, the Dow is actually falling in value when it's compared against real money. And so, that's one aspect. But then also when we look at the and I remember listening to Milton Friedman on this, where he talks about how the average citizen is also part of the problem because, we want the benefits. We want to vote in, the politician that's going to pass a bill or pass some type of budget item that's going to benefit us. And we don't have the money, right? It's like, dude, like we're in the negative. And then, and people are confusing money with currency as well, and so I think, kind of wondering in your perspective on what can people share with like their families and friends about like what is real money and explaining this issue, because I think there's a lot of people that are misinformed and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors about what money really is.
Well, I do want to point out, because you raise a very, very important point about India and China, being traditional about having gold and silver. But before the rise of the West, I mean, India and China were great, civilizations. And, they were tremendous in terms of their economy and their populations and so forth. And then they experienced centuries of inflation, in India and in China, and it brought both of them down into poverty-stricken nations, both of them. And so they learned the hard way. They learned the hard way of suffering generations after generations after generations. They fell way behind the West. And they're only now just getting themselves up off the ground. But they have this tremendous tradition of knowing that gold and silver are fundamental for some reason. And they may not even understand it. They may not really know why, Chinese and Indians are so attached to gold and silver gifting and, all of that kind of stuff. The United States has only been off the gold standard for 50 years. And so, our economy until just recently, in the last decade, has been the strongest in the world. And right now, it's, visibly, statistically, it's still, number one, but you can tell underneath that it's weakened out, it's been hollowed out, and we owe so much money to so many people that we're obviously a much weaker economy. And so restoring that belief, that strong attachment, that tradition about gold and silver, I think, we can go back and learn the lessons of American history with respect to that, learn the lessons about hyperinflation that Professor Hanke has told us so much about, both historically and in the current context, the lessons of hyperinflations around the world that have destroyed civilizations, how it brought down Germany, led to fascism and Nazism in Italy and in Germany. Once we start relearning our economics and our history and even about business too, that people grow up nowadays and they think, well, I'm making much more money than my father made or my grandfather, without ever being it explained to them that everything has gone up in price. And it's just a matter of inflation causing all prices over time to rise up, so that, you've got a $500,000 house. You're a 30-year-old and, executive with a $500,000 condo or house, but it's the same house or the same condominium that used to cost $50,000 a generation ago, or could have been built, even in the grandfather's time, for $5,000. So, there's an illusion. The inflationary illusion is what we have to come to grips with, and what we have to teach people about. That's one of the great things that we do here at the Mises Institute, is to illuminate people about history, and also not just to be for free markets or to be against government because it always messes up, but we explain why government actions are always troublesome and cause problems and never really solve anything. And we also explain to students and the general public, how the market works. Why does it work for us? Why is there an increase in the standard of living when an economy is based on free markets? Why have 1 billion Chinese and Indians been risen out of severe poverty in the last 20, 25 years? How is that possible? And so we explain these things and the processes that take place in order to achieve that. It's not a miracle. It's not some, miraculous, mysterious remedy, or it's not a cultural thing necessarily. It's not a racial thing or a religious thing. It's the market economy at work, allowing people to make themselves better off. And when they make themselves better off, they're helping their customers, they're helping their workers, they're helping everybody else rise up from the bottom up. And that's really one of the most general lessons that I can teach anybody, is that things that are good for us come from the bottom up, and nothing is good that comes from the top down. And everybody understands that implicitly, but they still go out there and they believe their politicians are somehow going to solve their problems. But nothing good comes from the top down. Everything that's good and wholesome comes from the bottom up.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's very insightful, and I appreciate this conversation because I'm learning a lot in this conversation as well. So you mentioned that a source that the people can go to is Mises.org. Where can they learn more and continue on this education journey?
MISES.org. Ludwig von Mises was the great Austrian economist, the great free market thinker. He really revolutionized the way economics is structured. And we are great proponents of his work, and the entire Austrian school, which is mostly in the United States these days. And we have, daily articles galore. We have audio and video lectures. We produce books, which you can download for free all around the globe. We have children's books. We're giving away free copies of this book of greatest hits articles by F.A. Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize. He was Mises's great graduate student in Vienna, Austria. And we have conferences. We have a conference coming up in Oklahoma City. We have one coming up in San Antonio. It's not like we go to New York and Washington, and places like that. We go to the heartland of America. We've been to Seattle, and places like that. But I think just the fact that our next two conferences are in Oklahoma City and in San Antonio, Texas, tells you a lot about where we're coming from, this common sense but logical system of economics where we can teach you why the market works. How does the market work? And why government is always going to fail and make things worse in the long run. And so I'd encourage everybody to go to MISES.org. It's open, it's free, 365, and there's no registration or anything. And so it's a great educational resource. So please check it out. Spend some time with us.
Yes, I'm definitely going to do that myself, and I'm actually from Oklahoma City, so I may have to try to make it down to that conference or something. We'll see.
Excellent.
Well, Dr. Mark, appreciate you for coming on the show. Definitely got to have you back as things continue to unfold and such. Where can people follow you? I know you're on X and you're active on some of these social media platforms, right?
Yeah, I'm on X, and my work appears regularly on Mises.org, and I have my own podcast. It's called Minor Issues, MINOR, not gold miner type miner, but small issues that are not addressed in the mainstream media, or points about the major issues which are not addressed from an Austrian economic, free market economic point of view. And so I post my interviews and my analysis of the economy and other things that I find interesting. And it's only usually a 10-minute podcast. So I'd encourage everybody to look me up by name, Mark Thornton, and Minor Issues Podcast, and check it out. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Well, you all have the information. Thank you, Dr. Mark, for coming on the show. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please hit the subscribe button. Love to how you support. Turn on the bell for notifications as well. Thank you, Dr. Mark.
Thank you, Darrell. It's a pleasure.